Rick laughed in court and told the judge I couldn't afford a lawyer. Not quietly either, not under his breath. He leaned back in that navy suit too sharp for a Tuesday morning in Licking County and said it like it was a fact everybody already knew. "I mean, Your Honor," he added, almost smiling, "she doesn't have the money for that." There was a pause. Not a dramatic one, just the kind where people shift in their seats and pretend not to be listening. I was standing there in my old Clark's flats, the same pair I'd worn to church and grocery runs for years, clean but worn at the heel. My hands were wrapped around a manila folder I'd carried in like it mattered more than it did. I didn't say anything. For a long time I didn't say anything. Then Judge Vasquez looked down at the papers in front of her, adjusted her glasses, and said very calmly, "Mrs. Callahan won't need counsel. She appears to be the only one here who can answer these questions clearly." That was the moment the room shifted. Rick stopped smiling. His attorney, Mr. Green, I think his name was, opened his mouth like he was about to say something, then closed it again. Behind him, Tiffany lowered her eyes. And for the first time in years, someone was looking at me like I wasn't just standing there to fill space. It didn't start in a courtroom. It started long before that in a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and paper. Newark, Ohio. Our house sat on a quiet street where everybody knew everybody, or at least pretended to. Split level, beige siding, wind chimes that never stopped clinking when the weather turned. Rick used to leave before sunrise most days, steel toe boots, thermos, truck engine coughing awake in the driveway while I stood at the sink rinsing out last night's plates. "Don't forget to call Henderson about that permit," he'd say halfway out the door. I never did forget. That was my job, even if nobody ever called it that. Rick owned Callahan Custom Homes. At least that's what the sign said. His name on it, bold and blue, staked into half-finished yards all over Licking County. But the truth was simpler. Rick sold the dream. I made sure it didn't fall apart. I was the one who answered when a subcontractor called at 6:30 in the morning, asking where his check was. The one who sat on hold with insurance companies while folding laundry. The one who kept track of permits, invoices, change orders, fuel receipts, payroll corrections, every little thing that made the business look smooth from the outside. Rick didn't like details, he liked deals. He'd shake hands, make promises, come home smelling like sawdust and aftershave, and say things like, "Deb, you're good with this stuff, you handle it." And I did. For 22 years I did. He liked to say in front of people, "Deb takes care of the small stuff, I bring in the money." I remember one night at a Rotary dinner in Heath. He had his arm around my chair, smiling at a table full of men who nodded along like that made perfect sense. "Couldn't do it without her," he said, but it sounded like a joke, like something polite you say before ordering dessert. They laughed. I smiled. Then I went home and stayed up until midnight fixing a payroll error he didn't even know he'd made. We had a son, Evan. He's 24 now, lives in Columbus, works in IT. Quiet like me, but sharper with his words. I still keep a picture of him in my wallet. 2nd grade, missing front tooth, holding up a drawing of a house that looked nothing like anything Rick ever built. Back then things felt simpler, or maybe I was just too busy to notice what was changing. Because it didn't all fall apart at once. It wore down. Little things first. Rick staying out later, not answering calls, coming home distracted. Then the comments. "You're always so tired. You never want to go anywhere. Maybe try dressing up a little more." Stuff that doesn't sound like much when you say it out loud, but it sticks. Like something catching on fabric, pulling threads loose one by one. The first time I knew something was really wrong, I wasn't even looking for it. I was at the kitchen table with a stack of statements. End of the month. I always did a quick check just to make sure everything lined up before sending things over to our CPA in Heath. I saw a charge that didn't make sense. Fuel, $200. On a day I knew the truck hadn't left the driveway. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I moved on. That's the thing about being married that long. You learn how to let things go even when they don't feel right. But the little things didn't stop. They added up. Another charge, then another. A hotel in Dublin. A jewelry store purchase labeled client gift. I remember sitting there, highlighter in hand, marking things like I always did. Yellow for normal, that was my system. That night I picked up a pink one from the drawer. I don't know why. Just something in me wanted to separate what didn't belong. By the time I finished, there was more pink on those pages than yellow. I didn't cry. Not then. I just sat there in the quiet listening to the refrigerator hum and tried to make it make sense. The first time I asked him about it, he didn't even sit down. "What's this charge?" I said, holding the paper up like it mattered. He glanced at it barely. "Business expense. It's not labeled." "It doesn't need to be." I waited. He sighed like I was the one making things difficult. "Deb, you don't understand how this works." That was the first time he said it like that. Not joking, not light. Flat. Like a door closing. After that, I stopped asking as much. Not because I didn't care. Because I could feel something shifting and I didn't know how to stand in front of it without getting knocked over. Then came Tiffany. I didn't know her name at first. I just knew the smell. Different perfume, not mine, not anything I'd ever wear. Then the phone. Messages lighting up late at night, Rick turning the screen away like it was nothing. One afternoon I drove past one of the new builds out near Granville. Rick's truck was there. So was she. I saw her climb out of the passenger side laughing at something he said, blonde hair catching the light, young enough to still think everything in life was about to get better. I sat in my car longer than I should have. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, but I didn't honk, didn't get out. I just watched. Then I drove home. It got worse after that. Not louder. Quieter. Like he didn't even feel the need to hide it properly anymore. She started showing up in small ways. A throw pillow in the living room that wasn't mine. A different kind of hand soap in the bathroom. Once I came home and found her in the kitchen. She smiled like she was doing me a favor. "Rick said you wouldn't mind," she said, holding a vase like she belonged there. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I just set my keys down and walked past her. That's what people don't tell you. Sometimes the worst part isn't the betrayal. It's how quietly it's allowed to exist. A few weeks later, I saw a message on Rick's phone. He'd left it on the counter, screen unlocked. I wasn't trying to snoop, but it was right there. "Rick says you're strong," it read. "You'll be fine." I stood there staring at it. Then I put the phone down exactly where it had been. The night everything finally cracked, I wasn't even angry. Just tired. Rick came home late, smelled like something that wasn't this house. "There's no beer," he said, opening the fridge like that was the biggest problem in the room. I was at the table, papers spread out again, highlighter in hand. "I forgot," I said. He shook his head. "Of course you did." I didn't look up. Not right away. When I did, I realized something simple. He wasn't looking at me. Not really. Not anymore. Maybe he hadn't been for a long time. That night after he went to bed, I stayed at the table. The house was quiet. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock over the stove. I picked up the pink highlighter again. And I started marking everything that didn't feel right. Line after line. Page after page. My hand steadied as I went. Not shaking anymore. Not confused. Just focused. Because somewhere between that kitchen table and that courtroom, I stopped trying to understand him. And started paying attention to the truth. That was the first time in years someone asked me a question, and actually waited for my answer. And Rick, he was finally going to hear it. If you had walked into my kitchen back then, you wouldn't have thought anything was wrong. Coffee pot on, radio low, a stack of mail off to one side, same as always. That's the thing about it, nothing looked broken. But if you sat long enough, really sat, you'd notice the paper. It was everywhere. Receipts, statements, invoices, envelopes I hadn't opened yet because I already knew what I'd find inside them. I used to keep everything neat, labeled, filed, color-coded in my own quiet way. That changed the night I picked up the pink highlighter. I started staying up later. Not on purpose, I just couldn't sleep. Rick would be in bed snoring like nothing in the world could touch him, and I'd be sitting at the kitchen table in that dim overhead light, going line by line through things I'd already seen 100 times. Only now, I wasn't fixing mistakes. I was looking for them. There's a difference. At first, I told myself I was overreacting. People make messy entries. Accounts don't always line up right away. But then I started noticing patterns. Fuel charges on days the truck didn't move. Equipment rentals with no paperwork behind them. Transfers that didn't match any job we had going. I'd circle them, then highlight them. Yellow for normal. Pink for something else. By the end of the week, most of the page was pink. Rick didn't notice. Or maybe he did and didn't care. One night he came in while I was still at the table. "What are you doing now?" he asked, dropping his keys like they weighed something. "Just going over things," I said. "You've been going over things a lot lately." I didn't answer that. He opened the fridge, stared inside. "No beer again." "I can go get some," I said, already pushing my chair back. He waved a hand. "Forget it, I'll just grab something tomorrow." He closed the door harder than he needed to. I sat back down, picked up the highlighter again. The truth is, I'd spent years making sure things ran smooth enough that nobody had to ask questions. That included me. But once you start looking, it's hard to stop. There was one charge I couldn't shake. $45,000. Labeled as equipment rental. We didn't rent equipment like that, not in one chunk, not without paperwork, not without me knowing about it. I went back through older files. Pulled out boxes from the basement, the kind with handwritten labels, Westbrook Project, Henderson Build, things like that. Dust got all over my hands. I didn't mind. I was used to working in places nobody else wanted to deal with. Rick used to say I had a knack for keeping things from falling apart. He never asked how. That weekend I matched that $45,000 to a transfer. Different account. Same date. That's when I felt it. Not panic. Not even anger. Just a shift. Like something in me settling into place. Around that time, Tiffany stopped pretending I wasn't there. She didn't get loud. That would have been easier to deal with. She got comfortable. I came home one afternoon and found new throw pillows on the couch. Not the ones I'd picked out years ago. These were brighter, softer, not my style. She was in the kitchen again. "Rick said you wouldn't mind," she said, rinsing out a glass like she belonged there. I set my purse down. "I do mind," I said. She blinked, surprised, not offended, just surprised I'd spoken. "Oh," she said, "I didn't realize." Rick walked in behind her like timing didn't matter. "What's going on?" he asked. "She's redecorating," I said. He looked at the pillows, shrugged. "They look fine." Of course they did. They weren't meant for me. Later that night, I saw another message on his phone. He'd left it face up this time. "Rick says you're strong," it read again like a line she'd practiced. "You'll land on your feet." I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I turned the screen off. Not because I was done. Because I was starting. I began making copies, quietly. Not stealing anything, not breaking into anything. Just copying what I already handled every day. Bank statements, vendor invoices, tax returns, internal spreadsheets I'd built myself years ago because Rick didn't like software. I kept everything in a plastic bin in the back of my closet under old winter coats. Every page dated. Every note written in the margins in my own handwriting. I bought a small notebook from Kroger. Nothing fancy, just lined paper. I started writing things down. Dates, amounts, what didn't match. I didn't know exactly what I was building. Just that I needed it. There were moments I almost stopped. Standing in the pantry one afternoon staring at rows of canned soup, I realized I'd been there for 10 minutes and hadn't moved. I couldn't remember what I came in for. That scared me more than anything Rick had done. Because it meant I was disappearing. I picked up a can at random. Chicken noodle. Set it back down. Then I went to the kitchen table and opened my notebook. Wrote the date at the top of the page. Forced my hand to keep moving. The subcontractors still called me. They always had. "Deb, you got a minute?" Deb, just checking on that payment. They didn't ask for Rick. Not unless they had to. I made sure their checks went out. On time, every time. One of them, Tommy, older guy, worked with us for years, said once half joking, "You're the only reason any of us sleep at night, Deb." I laughed it off. But I remembered it. Because Rick didn't see those calls. Didn't hear the relief in their voices when I told them their money was on the way. He saw contracts. I saw people. The more I went through, the clearer it got. Money was moving in ways it shouldn't. Not just small amounts. Enough to matter. Enough to change everything if someone really looked at it. I started cross-checking names. Companies we'd worked with. Accounts we'd paid. One name kept showing up in places it didn't belong. Not in big letters. Just tucked in. Like it wasn't supposed to stand out. Mercer Property Solutions, LLC. I stared at it on the page. Once. Twice. Then I leaned back in my chair and said the name out loud. Mercer. The kitchen felt very quiet. I didn't cry. Not this time. I didn't feel shocked. Or even hurt. Just clear. Like someone had finally turned a light on in a room I'd been walking through in the dark. Tiffany Mercer. I picked up my pen. Drew a line under the name. Wrote the date next to it. Then I closed the folder. Not because I was done. Because I knew exactly where this was going now. I stood up, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed without checking if Rick was asleep. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel confused. I felt steady. Tiffany Mercer. I stared at that name for a long time. And that was the moment I stopped crying. And started keeping records. Once I saw her name in the paperwork, everything else changed. Up until then, I'd been reacting. Trying to understand. Trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. After that, I stopped guessing. I started checking. I didn't use the computer at home anymore. Not for this. Rick wasn't careful about much, but I didn't know what he might notice if I started digging too deep. And I wasn't about to tip my hand before I understood what I was holding. So I went somewhere he'd never think to look. The Newark Public Library. It felt strange the first time I walked in with a purpose that had nothing to do with returning a book or helping Evan with homework like I used to. The place hadn't changed much. Same worn carpet, same quiet hum, same mix of people, students with headphones, older folks reading newspapers, a couple of men who looked like they were just there to stay warm. I signed up for a computer slot and sat down between a college girl typing fast and a man who smelled faintly like cigarettes in winter. I opened the county auditor's website, and I started searching. Property records. Parcel numbers. Names. Addresses. It wasn't complicated. Just slow. And steady. The first few searches didn't show much. Callahan Custom Homes came up, of course. Lots we'd developed. Properties we'd sold. Everything looked normal on the surface. But then I typed in Mercer. And there it was. Mercer Property Solutions, LLC. Registered just over a year ago. Address listed, not a business location. A residential one. I leaned closer to the screen. I knew that address. I'd driven past it once or twice on the way out toward Granville. Small place, new siding, too neat for something that didn't have a real business behind it. I clicked through the details. There was a property attached to it. Undeveloped land. Purchased 6 months ago. I checked the amount. Then I checked it again. It matched. The same week that $45,000 had moved out of our business account, that property had been purchased under her company's name. I sat there staring at the screen, my hand still on the mouse, not moving, not blinking. For a second I felt something rise up in me. Not tears. Something sharper. And then unexpectedly, I laughed. Not loud. Just a short breath of a sound I didn't recognize at first. Because suddenly, for the first time in months, this wasn't confusing anymore. This wasn't about a man drifting away. This wasn't about a younger woman and a broken marriage. This was about money. And lies. And the quiet assumption that I would never look closely enough to see either one. I pulled out my notebook. Wrote down everything I saw. Date, amount, property ID. My handwriting was steady. More than it had been in a long time. Everything okay over there? I looked up. The man next to me had turned slightly curious. I nodded. Yeah, I said, just figuring something out. He nodded back like that made sense. Maybe it did. I went back the next day. And the day after that? Each time I found something new. Not huge on its own. But together, it painted a picture. Transfers that didn't line up. Expenses that didn't belong. Connections that only made sense if you knew where to look. And I did. Because I'd been the one keeping those records for years. There was a moment sitting there in that library when I stopped and leaned back in my chair. I looked around. At the students. At the quiet. At the man asleep in the corner. And I thought, what am I doing? I didn't like the answer that came back right away. Because it sounded a little too close to something I didn't want to be. Someone bitter. Someone digging just to hurt someone else. I closed my eyes for a second. And then I remembered. Rick coming home late. The smell that wasn't mine. The way he'd said, "You don't understand how this works." I opened my eyes, looked back at the screen. And I knew. This wasn't about getting even. This was about not being lied to anymore. That difference mattered. Things at home got worse. Not louder. Still quiet. But colder. One afternoon I came home and noticed something missing. My car. An old Honda I'd had for years, nothing special, but it was mine. I stood in the driveway for a minute thinking maybe I'd parked it somewhere else. Then Rick's truck pulled in behind me. "Where's my car?" I asked. He didn't look at me when he answered. "Sold it." I waited. "You what?" "It was just sitting there," he said. "We needed the cash." "We." That word hit harder than anything else. "You didn't think to tell me." "It's in your best interest," he said, like he was explaining something simple to a child. "We're separating anyway. Makes things easier." I didn't argue. Not then. Because I could feel something building again. And I wasn't ready to let it out the wrong way. The next morning I walked to the grocery store. It wasn't far. But it was far enough. Cold air, hands in my pockets, head down. I passed 2 houses with for sale signs out front. Thought about how many of those I'd helped make happen. When I got back, I didn't go inside right away. I stood in the driveway. Looked at the house. Tried to remember when it stopped feeling like mine. Then I went in. Straight to the kitchen table. Opened my notebook. And kept going. Evan called that night. He didn't call often, busy with work, his own life. But when I picked up, I could hear something in his voice. "Mom?" "Hey, honey." There was a pause. "You okay?" I almost said yes. Habit. Instead, I told the truth. "I'm figuring things out." Another pause. Then, "I always knew you were the one holding everything together." I closed my eyes. Not because I was sad. Because I needed a second to steady myself. "Your dad thinks he's the business he went on, but, Mom, you are." We didn't talk about Rick much after that. We didn't need to. A few days later, I took what I had to a legal aid clinic. Nothing fancy. Just a small office near downtown with fluorescent lights and chairs that didn't quite match. I sat there with my folder in my lap, waiting to be told I was overthinking everything. That this was normal. That I should just take whatever settlement Rick offered and move on. Instead, a man with gray hair and tired eyes flipped through my papers. Slowly. Carefully. He didn't interrupt. Didn't rush. Finally, he looked up at me. "Did you put all this together yourself?" "Yes." He nodded. "You've got documentation here that raises some serious questions." Questions. That word again. Only this time it felt different. About what I asked. He tapped one of the pages. Undisclosed assets, possibly misrepresented income. He paused. "Maybe more." I felt it then. Not fear. Not relief. Just confirmation. I nodded. Closed the folder. "Okay," I said. When I got home, Rick wasn't there. His phone was on the counter. A message lit up the screen. "Don't forget the printer. I need those docs tomorrow." I picked it up. Looked at it. Then set it back down exactly where it had been. Because he still thought I didn't understand what he was doing. He thought I didn't understand his business. The truth was, I was the only one who ever did. By the time we walked back into that courtroom, I wasn't shaking the same way. Still nervous, of course. But it was different now. Before, I felt like I didn't belong there. Now, I knew exactly why I was standing in that room. Rick got there early. He always liked being first, made him feel in control. Same suit as before, pressed, expensive, the kind of thing that looks like success if you don't ask too many questions. I knew exactly how it had been paid for. He nodded at his attorney, leaned in, said something under his breath that made them both smirk. Like this was already handled. Like I was already taken care of. Tiffany was there too. Sitting in the second row this time, not hiding as much, but not exactly confident either. She didn't look at me when I walked in. That was new. I took my place at the table. Same folder in my hands. But it didn't feel like something I was holding on to anymore. It felt like something I was ready to set down. When Judge Vasquez entered, the room stood. Then sat. Papers shuffled. A chair creaked somewhere behind me. The kind of small sounds you notice when everything else is about to matter. Rick's attorney started. Smooth voice, confident. Your Honor, my client is prepared to move forward with an equitable resolution. Mrs. Callahan has no independent income, no formal business training. I tuned him out halfway through. Not because I didn't care, because I already knew what he was going to say. And we believe it's in everyone's best interest to proceed efficiently. Efficient. That word almost made me smile. Judge Vasquez didn't respond right away. She flipped through a few pages in front of her. Then she looked up. Mr. Callahan, she said, I have a few questions. Rick straightened in his seat. Of course, Your Honor. Who handled payroll for your company? Rick blinked once. My office. Specifically. A pause. My wife helped with that. Helped, the judge repeated. She made a note. Who reconciled your vendor accounts? Another pause. Deb did some of that, yes? Prepared documents for your CPA. Rick shifted. She organized things, but Judge Vasquez raised a hand. Mrs. Callahan, she said, turning to me, would you step forward? I stood. My legs felt steady. That surprised me. Yes, Your Honor. Did you handle payroll for Callahan Custom Homes? Yes. Vendor accounts? Yes. Tax documentation? Yes. She nodded. Thank you. Simple. No speech. No drama. Just answers. Then she looked back at Rick. And you are familiar with the financial records submitted to this court? Of course, he said quickly. She tapped a page. Then perhaps you can explain a discrepancy. Rick leaned forward. This is regarding a transfer, she said. $45,000, labeled as equipment rental. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. Rick cleared his throat. That would be an investment. In what? A business opportunity. Judge Vasquez tilted her head slightly. And the recipient of this transfer? Rick hesitated. His attorney shifted beside him. A company, Rick said. Yes, the judge said. A company registered as Mercer Property Solutions, LLC. Silence. Not the kind you hear. The kind you feel. Is that your company, Mr. Callahan? Number. Do you have an ownership interest in it? Number. She glanced toward the back of the room. Is the individual seated behind you, Ms. Mercer, associated with that company? Rick didn't answer right away. Mr. Callahan. Yes, he said, quieter now. And the property purchased by that company was acquired the same week as this transfer. Rick's attorney leaned in. Your Honor, if I may. You may not, she said without raising her voice. The room shifted. I could feel it. Like something invisible had just tipped. Judge Vasquez turned back to me. Mrs. Callahan, are you familiar with this transaction? Yes. How? I recorded it, I said. She waited. I handled the accounts I added. It didn't match any active job or rental agreement, so I flagged it. Flagged it, she repeated. Yes. I opened my folder. Set a few pages on the table. Not all of them. Just enough. These are the corresponding entries, I said. Dates, amounts, and the transfer. She looked them over. Carefully. The way someone does when they're not just skimming. Rick shifted again. I could hear his breathing now. Judge Vasquez adjusted her glasses. Then she looked at him. Mr. Callahan, she said you previously stated under oath that your business was operating at a loss. Yes, he said. And yet you had sufficient funds to transfer $45,000 to a third-party entity connected to your companion. It wasn't like that. Then how was it? Rick opened his mouth, closed it. For a second I almost felt sorry for him. Not because of what was happening, because he genuinely didn't know what to say without me. His attorney tried again. Your Honor, these matters can be clarified. They will be, she said. Another pause. Then, Mrs. Callahan, she said, turning to me once more, you stated you do not have formal accounting training. No, ma'am. And yet you maintained these records for over 2 decades. Yes. She nodded slowly. Rick's attorney seized the moment. Exactly, Your Honor. She is not a certified professional. I spoke before I could stop myself. Not loud. Just clear. I don't have a degree, I said. The room stilled again. I just made sure nobody who worked for him went home unpaid. No one interrupted. Not the judge. Not the lawyer. Not even Rick. Judge Vasquez looked at me for a long second. Then back at the papers. Noted, she said. That was it. No speech. No reaction. Just one word. But it landed. Rick leaned back in his chair. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked unsure. Not angry. Not defensive. Just lost. Tiffany shifted in her seat behind him. I heard a chair scrape softly. When I glanced back, she was already standing. She didn't look at him. Didn't say anything. Just walked out. Rick didn't notice right away. He was too busy staring at the papers in front of him. Like they were written in a language he didn't understand. The judge continued. Calm, measured. Talking about disclosures. About inconsistencies. About the need to reevaluate. Words that sounded simple, but carried weight. By the time she finished, the outcome wasn't final. Not yet. But it was clear. Nothing was going to stay hidden anymore. Rick sat there flipping through documents. His hands weren't steady. For the first time in our marriage, he didn't know what to say. And I didn't need him to. People think the best part of something like that is the moment the other person finally gets caught. It isn't. That part feels good, I won't lie to you. Standing in that courtroom while Rick sat there sweating through a suit he couldn't bluff his way out of anymore. There was satisfaction in that. A deep one. But it wasn't the best part. The best part came later. Quietly. When I woke up one morning and realized I didn't have to spend one more day protecting a man who had spent years making me feel small. The case didn't wrap up overnight. Real life almost never does. There were more filings, more meetings, more time spent in rooms with bad coffee and fluorescent lights. The court ordered a full review of the business records. The valuation had to be redone. The hidden property linked to Mercer Property Solutions got pulled into the divorce estate. Rick was sanctioned for failing to disclose assets properly, and once that started, other things followed. Our CPA, a patient man named Leonard Baines out of Heath, suddenly had a lot more questions than Rick wanted to answer. Then the bank had questions. Then the court did. Later, I heard the state tax people were looking into discrepancies too. I don't know how far that went. I didn't chase it. By then, I didn't need to. What mattered was simpler. He couldn't stand in public and pretend I was confused anymore. Tiffany disappeared fast. That part almost would have been funny if it hadn't been so sad. For months, she had acted like she was stepping into some better life. Like all she had to do was wait for me to move aside and the nice house, the truck, the dinners out, the little fake luxury version of success Rick liked to show off would all settle neatly into her lap. But once the court reopened the financial picture, once the words sanctions and valuation and undisclosed assets started getting thrown around, she was gone. No dramatic fight, no tearful goodbye. Just gone. One day her car was in the driveway. A week later it wasn't. Rick called her twice while I was still in the house packing things. I know because I heard him leave voicemails from the mudroom while I was wrapping plates in newspaper. Call me back. Then later, sharper. Tiffany, don't do this now. I kept wrapping plates. I didn't smile. I didn't comment. I just folded the paper around the dishes I had bought at Kohl's 15 years earlier with a coupon in my purse and a toddler waiting in the cart. That was another thing I learned. You can wait a long time for a big dramatic ending, and sometimes what you get instead is a man standing alone in a house he doesn't know how to run. Turns out that was enough. The final settlement wasn't some fairy tale. I didn't walk away with a beach house or $1 million or a brand new life in a movie sense. What I got was better. I got the truth written down where it counted. I got a fair share of what had actually been built during that marriage, not the insulting scraps Rick first offered me. I got my portion of the real business value after the records were corrected. I got my interest in the house protected. I got enough to start over without begging anyone's permission. And maybe most important of all, I got my own name back in my own head. I moved into a small condo near Granville. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, beige carpet, little patch of concrete out back instead of a real porch. But the kitchen got good morning light, and the first time I stood in it with my own mug in my hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Not excitement, not triumph. Just relief. The kind that settles in your chest and lets you breathe all the way down again. I bought an old armchair from a thrift store in Newark. Floral, a little faded solid underneath. The woman at the register said, "This one's got good bones." I laughed and told her that was exactly what I was hoping for. I put it by the window in the living room with a lamp and a small side table. On Saturday mornings, I'd sit there with tea and the paper, and if the phone rang, it was for me. Not for Rick. Not for the business. Not for some mess I needed to clean up before somebody else noticed it. For me. That took some getting used to. I also started working again. Paid work, I mean. Not the kind of labor that disappears because it happens in a kitchen or behind a marriage. A local roofing supplier in Heath needed part-time back-office help. Accounts payable, vendor paperwork, basic scheduling, nothing glamorous. But when the owner, a woman named Carla, looked at my resume and said, "You've got more experience than half the people I interview," I nearly cried right there in her office. Not because it was a huge job. Because she saw it. All those years hadn't vanished just because nobody had put my name on the company sign. Evan came home the weekend I moved in. He brought coffee, a toolbox, and more patience than I deserved while I changed my mind 3 times about where the couch should go. At one point, he stood in the middle of the living room holding a lamp and said, "Mom, you know this place is like 800 square feet, right? There are only so many options." That made me laugh harder than I had in months. Later, after we got everything mostly where it belonged, we drove over to Bob Evans for dinner because I was too tired to cook. Same kind of place we'd gone 100 times over the years. Brown booths, syrup bottles on the table, waitress calling everybody hon. I ordered turkey and dressing. Evan got a cheeseburger and fries like he was still 17. When the food came, he looked at me for a second before picking up his fork. "What?" I said. He shook his head. "I'm just proud of you." I looked down at my plate. "Well, don't say it too loud. I've still got half my life in boxes." "I'm serious, Mom." I looked back up. He was. "Not because you won," he said, "because you didn't let him decide what you were worth." That hit me harder than anything the judge had said. Because when it comes from your child, it goes straight in. No filter, no defense. Just truth. I nodded once and reached for my tea because suddenly I needed something to do with my hands. "Thank you," I said. That was all I could manage. But he understood. I heard things about Rick after that. Small-town things, contractor things, people always know more than they let on. A job delayed because paperwork hadn't been filed right. A crew upset over late checks. A client complaining he stopped returning calls once the county started asking for additional records. Nothing dramatic, no big public collapse. Just the slow, ordinary consequences of a man discovering that the part of his life he dismissed as small stuff had actually been holding up the whole roof. I never called to verify any of it. Didn't need to. I already knew what happened when Rick had to manage everything alone. I'd been covering for it for 22 years. One evening, maybe 3 months after I moved, I sat down at my kitchen table with a fresh notebook. Nothing special, spiral-bound, blue cover. For a second, I just looked at it. Then I opened to the first page. At the top, I wrote, "Deborah's life." I stared at those 2 words longer than I expected to. Not because they were dramatic, because they were plain. And plain was what I wanted now. A life where the bills made sense. A home where I knew why every object was there. A phone that didn't make my stomach tighten every time it lit up. Peace, I found out, isn't flashy. It's practical. It sounds like a dishwasher running in a home where nobody is lying to you. It looks like buying your own curtains and knowing nobody's going to replace them while you're out. It feels like sitting in an old thrift store chair on a Sunday morning drinking tea in silence that belongs to you. Sometimes people ask if I hate Rick. I don't. Not anymore. Hate is heavy. I carried enough for long enough. What I feel now is something more useful. Distance. And gratitude, if I'm being honest. Not for what he did, never that. But for what I finally had to see because of it. That I was never just anything. Not just a wife, not just help, not just the quiet one in the corner. I was the one keeping track. I was the one people trusted. I was the one who knew what was real. And once I stopped apologizing for that, everything changed. If you've ever had someone mistake your patience for weakness, I hope you remember this. Quiet doesn't mean powerless. Sometimes it just means you're paying attention. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it, and if you'd like, stay with me for the next one.